everyone. In the last few years, we've seen a number of... Hello? Hello? Hi. In the last few years, we've seen a number of cases from prominent media companies where employees have protested against editorial decisions. We've also seen journalists and editors who have left their jobs after receiving criticism from colleagues, for example, in the New York Times. Some people say that this is a result of a cancel culture that has found its way into the newsrooms and warn against the consequences this may have for the news media and our society in general. But what is cancel culture really? And what consequences does it have for journalism? And what makes the conversation so hard? We'll try to answer these questions today with our two guests, who I'm very happy to have with us. Daily Telegraph columnist Suzanne Moore and author and cultural writer Helen Pluckrose. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. It's lovely to be here.
Suzanne, you used to be a columnist at The Guardian, and your decision to leave the paper last year received quite a lot of attention. What happened?
Well, I wrote a column about a woman academic who had to have security guards at Oxford because of
Sorry, Suzanne, I think you should try again. We lost you in your sound in the beginning there.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah, okay. I wrote a piece in The Guardian about Selina Todd, who's an academic at Oxford, who has to walk around with security guards because of her views on trans issues. And I found it really terrible that this Oxford professor has to be protected because of her views. Her views are simply that biology is real. And I've been trying to write about this stuff for some time. I've been fairly blocked. I mean, I'm known to be quite outspoken. And I wrote the piece, and the next day in editorial conference, a trans woman who'd already actually resigned 6 weeks earlier resigned again. And there was a huge argument, apparently. I wasn't there. I don't ever go into the office. And then a day or so later, 338 employees of The Guardian wrote a letter. They didn't name me in the letter, but saying that they were sick of the amount of transphobia in The Guardian. So it felt very much aimed at me. And the editor took me out. I received a lot of support from within The Guardian, but it didn't feel like it was very much put out there in public. And I felt fairly upset and betrayed, if you like, because I'm used to working in newspapers with people who I disagree with. I thought any of these people could have picked up a phone and spoken to me about it, but they didn't. And of course, a lot of these people who signed the letter are not editors or journalists. They're just people who do, I don't know, digital in Australia or something. I don't know who they are, but are these people now in charge of the newsroom? Are they then in charge of comment? I don't really accept that they are. And so I carried on working at The Guardian because COVID started. So it was a bit all hands on deck kind of thing. And then over the summer, when I had a little bit more time to reflect on all of this, I felt that really I had been bullied and put in a kind of untenable position if I couldn't write about women's rights, because I've always written about women's rights. And if you can't write about women's rights in The Guardian, something's gone badly wrong, was my view. So I decided to leave.
Helen, Suzanne's story is one of many examples of what has been known as cancel culture. And it seems a bit hard to define, and several terms are being used when we talk about this. Wokeness, identity politics, social justice activism. Could you explain to us what cancel culture is?
What we're looking at when we talk about cancel culture, and we tend to talk mostly about critical social justice, so it's a very theoretical approach to looking at issues of social justice, is when if somebody like Suzanne or somebody with completely opposite ideas to Suzanne expresses their argument, instead of being responded to with a counter argument, even a strong one, they're responded to with threats, intimidation, attempts to fire them, attempts to no platform them, rather than having a conversation, rather than trying to discuss the point. So we see cancel culture when it hits, celebrity figures or people who are well known. We don't see it when it hits the average person, and that's what I do. 70% of the people that I deal with are blue or white collar workers who are being disciplined or coerced into pretending to believe things about race or gender that they don't believe, at the risk of their jobs and their livelihoods. That is what I would say is cancel culture. There is no room for disagreement.
In which areas of society is this most visible, would you say?
We're hearing particularly in the humanities and in the social fields. So I'm particularly concerned, I think that the main priority at the moment is humanitarian aid, medicine and charities. These are, I'm hearing from a lot of people working within them, that resources that are meant to be going to help people, women giving birth in Afghanistan or malnourished children in Yemen, are going into anti-white savior training. And people are tying themselves up in knots arguing about these ideologies rather than doing humanitarian efforts that are needed. Also, we're hearing a lot from psychologists who are being expected to see individuals not as individuals, but as symbols in a power structure, working through white supremacy, patriarchy, cisnormativity, etc. Social workers, teachers, parents, engineers. We hear a lot from engineers. I don't think there's particularly a huge problem in engineering, but I think that people who have that kind of technological, analytical mind, particularly as there's a large overlap with people who are neurologically atypical, are least likely to be able to get their heads around what they are and aren't allowed to say, and are more likely to find themselves in trouble for accidentally saying the wrong thing.
We have an international audience here. In which countries is this most visible today?
So I'm seeing it most, obviously I'm going to hear mostly from people in the Anglosphere, but I'm hearing, I think the problem is largest in the US, shortly followed by the UK. Canada is seeing a significant amount of it, Australia and New Zealand as well, but less so. In Europe, the people that we're hearing mostly from are in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. And these problems manifest somewhat differently in different countries. So in the US, we've got very much critical theories of race, while in Canada and Australia, there's more focus on indigeneity. Gender issues and the sort of the intimidation of gender critical feminists seems to be a particularly big problem in the UK and in Canada. And we have strong attempts to decolonize absolutely everything in the UK, which isn't appearing to such an extent or in quite the same way in the US. So it's the same sorts of theories. It's the idea that systems of power and privilege are built up by the powerful, who then dictate how we can know things and how we can speak about things. And we now have to monitor speech very, very carefully so we don't perpetuate these oppressive power systems. And we can't say anything that could be considered to speak into a dominant discourse and oppress anybody. So this is the justification that's given for no platforming conservatives or liberals like me or gender critical feminists.
Is it right to say that the goal, for example, more social and racial equality, is shared by many, also some of the people who are being cancelled?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that I really want to get people to understand, is that so many of the clients who are coming to us to complain about being supposed to affirm particular critical theories of race are not white. It's a different kind of problem. Obviously, if you are a white person who is being expected to affirm that you are racist and you need to dismantle your whiteness, that's bad enough if you are someone who has always hated racism. But if you're a Black or South Asian person and you're being told this is how you think, this is how you feel, and you actually don't think or feel like that at all, you have a different value system, it's another kind of problem. So yes, there are a lot of frameworks from which we can oppose all kinds of prejudices. And as Suzanne will say, we particularly need to be having a conversation at the moment about the potential conflict between women's rights and the acceptance of trans people in all realms of society, because there is a genuine conflict there, which needs to be resolved by reasonable discussion from people on both sides who care about women and trans people. And that isn't being allowed to happen. And while I'm sympathetic to both causes, I'm more concerned about the gender critical feminists at the moment, because they are the ones who are really receiving some quite serious threats.
Would you say, Suzanne, that you were cancelled?
No, I would never claim to be cancelled or silenced, because as Helen pointed out, if you have something of a profile and you're in the public eye, then it's not so easy for that to happen. I mean, I was able to carry on writing to get another job and so on. I'm always really concerned about people who write to me or approach me in the street, who are teachers, social workers, doctors, midwives, who feel very scared that if they say anything at all, they might lose their jobs. So-called ordinary people, if you like, who we're not going to read about in a newspaper, but people feel, for instance, you know, in a school, a teacher may see a little boy who puts on a skirt and think that's completely fine, kids play, but somebody else will want to whisk them off and try and understand if this child has gender dysphoria. And to speak against that is then seen somehow as transphobic. So I don't think people like me get cancelled. We get a lot of we get a lot of abuse and all of that, but it's just normal people who are often, again, as Helen said, absolutely liberal, who are seeking equality, who support trans people, who do not want to see racial injustice, but somehow just can't get their heads around the new language, which we haven't consented to. I think this is part of the difficulty. If you're going to change language, then you have to bring everybody along with it. For instance, I don't want to be called a menstruator or a cervix haver when we have the word woman, but that's something that some trans activists now insist on. And we have this language of, it's called inclusivity, but it ends up excluding many people. So there are bridges to be built, and one of them, I think, is around that actual language and why we might change the language, or why we might hold on to certain bits of the language. And but many of us feel that these changes have been imposed on us, and the idea that the trans movement, for instance, is the next civil rights movement is part of an ideology that I don't adhere to, because no other civil rights movement, whether it was Black people seeking equality in the States or gay people seeking equality, has demanded that anyone else give up their rights. Whereas this particular movement, if you like, asks for women to give up their rights to single-sex spaces, to their own language, and to the ability to name their own experiences. And that's where the conflict lies. And it's just would be a lot easier if we said, well, look, listen, there is a conflict, and this is one of the ways that we might, or some of the ways we might sort it out. But the tactics in the UK, for instance, have been, there is no debate. If we have a debate, you are denying and hurting trans people, which of course is not the intention of most feminists at all. I mean, it really, really isn't. And I see it all as a kind of massive deflection in some ways, because I don't think feminists are the enemies of trans people, and never will be. The enemies of both trans people who suffer discrimination and violence, just like women, are violent men. But that's not what we're talking about. So somehow people like J.K. Rowling or me are the sort of most evil people in the world, and it does drive you slightly mad sometimes.
And I think if I could add on to that, one thing that I think Suzanne pointed out, which is important, is that this, like the critical theories of race, it claims to speak for trans people, whereas in reality we hear from a large number of trans people who don't adhere to these theories, who haven't read queer theory, who don't ascribe to any kind of activism of this critical social justice kind. And the hostility towards trans people, I think, is growing, and it's coming from authoritarian trans activists rather than from the far right or from gender critical feminists. And as Suzanne said, sometimes people say, well, gender critical feminists, they're adding to this discourse that lets trans women get violently attacked. The number of people who have ever violently attacked a trans woman having read a gender critical feminist is I suspect, zero.
So would you say that cancel culture challenges the liberal norms that we have of open debate and toleration of different opinions?
Helen?
Well, I certainly would, yes. I mean, I like Suzanne, I can't say that I've been cancelled, but I've certainly been tried to remove me from conversations. The times that I have had to have a police escort, bodyguards, discussions with the police about whether death threats were genuine was when I wanted to be on a panel to discuss whether differences exist between men and women psychologically, which could explain the different interests in tech. Another time I wanted to suggest at a decolonized STEM symposium that arguing that science, technology, engineering, mathematics are male, Western and white is actually sexist and racist. I was told that I was unsafe for the other attendees and I had to be disinvited. And this makes it very difficult for us to have the conversations we need to have. And if we can't have different ideas, and even ones that we find really quite appalling, and we can't address them and we can't get at them, we can't advance.
Yes, yes.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that many of the strong critics of this culture are not the most liberal themselves? For example, we all remember how media companies and other liberal institutions were attacked by former President Trump.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a kind of, we weren't really ready for this kind of McCarthyism of the left. We expected it from the right, and we saw it with Trump. But a lot of this is done in the name of a progressive politics, a left-wing politics, a liberal politics. And how it affects newsrooms is not just in terms of what commentators like me write, but at The Guardian, for instance, one of the things that was said to me was that, well, we won't touch this subject because it's so, inflammatory, if you like, but we will do it through our reporting. That means that you still have this really outdated idea that reporting is somehow neutral and not ideological. There's no such thing. And what the result of that is, The Guardian simply did not report big stories that were happening. It just didn't touch them because they were very aware that their American audience, and they're competing with the New York Times, there's also a commercial interest here, would not like it. So we had, for instance, many of us journalists, we knew about the scandals that were going on at the Tavistock, which is a gender identity clinic that sees teenagers. Many people have blown the whistle there about the prescription of puberty blockers after only 2 or 3 sessions. There was a lot of disquiet. Professional therapists were coming and saying, hang on, something's going wrong here. Now, that's a story that, you don't have to take sides over. You simply need to report it, and the Guardian didn't. And there's many incidents of this. So I felt dissatisfied, not just that I couldn't write the things that I wanted to write, but that we were just kind of neglecting stories. And my view as somebody of the left who is liberal is that if you don't, as Helen said, go into these really difficult, uncomfortable areas, if you don't do it, you are really handing it over to the populist right, because they will do it and you will not be getting the results that you necessarily want. So I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said, journalism, the best journalism is what makes you feel uncomfortable. Those are the places that you need to go as a journalist. And the fact that the so-called liberal press is afraid to, I think, is a real loss of nerve, actually.
I agree. I think that's something that those of us who consider ourselves to be liberal, whether we are on the left as I am and Suzanne is, or liberals on the right who are sometimes called classical liberals, what we need to look at when we're pushing back at illiberalism, which in this case is coming from a part of the left with cancel culture, is if we're pushing back at it to open up speech, or if people are pushing back to enforce their own kind of authoritarianism. So I cannot support the anti-wokes who want to ban critical race theory, or who want to ban any kind of the theories, even the ones that I've dedicated years of my life to criticizing. Firstly, because that doesn't work. We can only defeat these ideas by arguing with them. And secondly, because it is illiberal, we will just change one flavor of illiberalism for another. So yes, we must not allow that to happen. And the best way that we can stop the populist right, stop the far right and the sort of Trumpist element of pushing this back from an illiberal way, is for the liberals to step up and do it, and the liberal lefties particularly to clean their house and open up conversations again.
We have a question via Zoom from our colleague Philip in Poland. He says, cancel culture seems to be an answer to hate speech, at least in Poland. What's the alternative?
Right, it's very difficult to know how each country defines hate speech. I see hate speech as an incitement to violence, and we have laws about that. I think for me to say, I don't think a woman should be walking around with bodyguards just because she believes biology is real, is hate speech. But you may disagree with me. You're totally entitled to disagree with me, right? But cancel culture as a concept, to defeating views that you don't like. I mean, one of the main problems with it is it simply actually doesn't work. I mean, it in some ways amplifies the speech that you think you don't like. You drive it underground, you drive it in bits of social media, or, we've seen it all happen, haven't we, with incels and all of this stuff. If people aren't allowed to say the bad things they think, they will find a place to say them these days. I mean, that's just how it is. So many people who have been cancelled then go off and find themselves another audience. And so I don't think it's the right response. I think you are entitled to if somebody is turning up, for instance, at a university and you find their views abhorrent, you don't have to go along, you don't have to agree. But I think, we're certainly in the UK at the moment, we're coming back to this argument about free speech, and the government is pushing for new rules on free speech. And it'll be very interesting to see how that goes, because traditionally, I would have thought the left stands for free speech, but that is no longer the situation.
I agree. Hate speech is so difficult to define because, you know, you can't judge what is being hateful and what isn't, and it isn't really the point anyway. If somebody says something which could be considered unambiguously hateful, something horrible about Black people or women or Jews, then yes, this is hateful speech. It needs to be argued with. The problem arises is if somebody were to say, follow me down the streets shouting misogynistic slurs at me, this would be harassment, this would be threatening behavior, this would be prosecutable. If somebody wants to write an essay or make some nasty tweets on their own Twitter account that were misogynistic, then I might argue with them, or I might, as Suzanne said, ignore them. That is the way to respond to hate speech. Hate speech is a problem when people can't get away from it, when people are being intimidated or threatened by it, and when we're not given the chance to argue with it and defeat it and show it as the awful ideas that it is.
You mentioned, Suzanne, how certain topics weren't that popular to be addressed in The Guardian. Do you see a form of self-censorship, you would say, in the press?
Yeah, I think that's a really key issue here now. I see not just self-censorship in the press, I see self-censorship in all of academia, in lots of social interactions even. I see a kind of closing down of critical thinking, what I would call actual critical thinking, and it's a real loss. If people feel afraid to speak because they will be challenged, it's often easier just to keep quiet. And it's the people that keep quiet who are the people who write to me a lot of the time. And you would be surprised at how qualified some of these people are. I have consultants, you know, in hospitals writing to me because they don't really go along with the ideology that sex is assigned at birth, because they are in fact geneticists who study neonatal disease, and therefore they know that sex is something that is determined, you know, in the womb, for instance. So because they won't use the current fashionable or, you know, language that sex is assigned at birth, they feel somehow that they can't continue to talk to their colleagues. And I mean, this becomes a really impossible situation when we are kind of asked to adhere to a faith that we don't really accept. I think that we all probably have friends who have beliefs or religions that we don't adhere to, but we respect them, but we don't have to believe the same things. But with these new sets of ideologies around, particularly around gender, Helen knows much more about the critical race thing than I do, but particularly around gender, I have to go along with something that I do not believe to be true. And I also think we actually lose a real global perspective too here, because if you believe that that gender is simply a feeling in someone's head and biological sex doesn't really exist or matter, well, that's a real, what we call luxury belief, because that might be great in the States, in certain parts of the States, might be good in the UK. But I mean, try going to Afghanistan and saying to women, yeah, you can just identify your way out of this, because this is where it all comes from. This kind of form of identity politics where my subjectivity and my subject position is the most important, and that defines reality. And what we're losing here with language as well is this consensus about reality. And Helen's written a lot about this, the consensus about truth, a consensus about how we speak about those things.
We have time for a question, if anyone has one from the audience.
Can you hear me? No? Hello? Hi, do you hear me? Yeah. This is Beatrice from Brazil. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the paradox of tolerance, because if you let someone be intolerant, then someday, like they can seize all the free speech that you have in society, and eventually the society would be no longer tolerant. And I think that it's something, it's, as you said, as the one from Poland said, sometimes the cancel culture is overreacting from the intolerance, because we see someone being intolerant, so we have the urge of silencing these people, so we react canceling it, especially in social media. It's difficult. So how can we identify when it's like you can let someone intolerant be intolerant? How we measure it?
So I would say that this is the weakness of liberalism, which has been pointed out by everybody from the conservatives to the Marxists. The reality is that if we have a liberal society in which people are allowed to express a full range of ideas, sometimes very bad ideas can get popular and they can spread. But we also see over history that societies which have allowed the free expression of ideas have also managed to beat the worst of those ideas most successfully. It is the countries which have most allowed everybody to speak, which have made the greatest advances in racial equality, LGBT equality, women's rights. So it's not a perfect system. Where you draw the line, I find that we can't really draw lines. So in my work, for example, we have to take things case by case. If somebody said something awful like, we need another Holocaust, and they worked in a Jewish school, would their employer be right to fire them? I think certainly yes. There's a real, this applies directly to their job. They're not suitable for it. If somebody is an accountant and they say on their own Twitter account, I don't believe in gender identity, should they be fired? And no, this is an opinion which is being expressed which doesn't affect that individual's ability to do accounts. So that's where the line is difficult to say, but the general spirit of allowing freedom of speech, unless it is directly harming or damaging materially another individual, is better than any other system, even if it's not perfect and it can allow bad ideas to survive, is the best that we can do as an imperfect species.
We could talk about this, I'm sure, for hours, but our time is up. Oh. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us from another island in Great Britain.
Thank you.
Oh. It was good to be here.
Hi, Helen.
Are we off now? I don't know what's...
To Suzanne and Helen, it's another British person talking to you here. So thanks very much for joining us today and giving your thoughts on this super interesting topic. We'll allow you to get on with the rest of your evening. Thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.